Good evening. Good evening, distinguished guests in my virtual living room. My name is Léontine Meijer-van Mensch, and I will introduce the guests of this virtual experience where we will reflect on memory and art, ethnology and museums later. First of all, I would like to say thank you for YouTubing with us. It's an honor. It's an honor that you are here. It's an honor if you're here live. It's also an honor if you look at this talk later. That's the wonderful thing about this digitalized Corona times, that you can look and watch and rewatch talks at any certain given moment. So I'm grateful that you are here, and I'm grateful that you're both here. Dear Michael, dear Alina, wonderful to have you here. I wish I could have invited you to Dresden, but due to Corona, that is unfortunately not possible. Michael, have you poured yourself a coffee?
Got something right here. Thank you.
Very, very, very good. I believe it's around 10 at your part of the world.
Yeah, 10 a.m. in Los Angeles.
Wonderful. Good to have you here. And Alina Gromova, she is live with us from a very beautiful island in the Baltic Sea. You actually look very relaxed, Alina. You have been sunbathing and relaxing the last couple of weeks, I hope.
Yeah, you can see I'm a little bit sunburned during the last couple of weeks. So sun is shining here in the Baltic Sea, weather is beautiful, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's an honor. It's an honor to have you. I'm very much looking forward to our talk. I've been looking forward to all the talks we had, and this is the last one. But maybe we will continue after this, because I feel there's still so much to be said in relation to the themes that we tackle in our exhibition. Wordless falling loud silently. It's a bit of a strange title, especially in English, but it's very hopefully poetic and Célanesque, because poetry has been very important for our exhibition. I always wanted to make an exhibition about poetry because it's so ultra subjective and also very associative. The idea was, or the research question was, how can you make that visible as an object in an exhibition space, and also how can it work as another layer of understanding, of connecting, of creating solidarity. And there, solidarity, I come to Michael. I first would like to introduce you, because you're two very established guests, and you need a kind of a framing. I don't know if there's anybody who doesn't know you both, but maybe there are. So I will say some words about your biographies. Michael Rothberg is professor of English and Comparative Literature and Holocaust Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He was the founding director of the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies at the University of Illinois. And Rothberg's interest in Holocaust studies and post-colonial studies, and that's interesting because we tackle both as well in our exhibition, began during his studies at City University of New York. So you've been tackling already this for quite some time, haven't you, Michael?
In a few years.
Yeah, it's been a while. He was interested in investigating the relationship between Jewish American culture and African American culture. In 2009, he published Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, in which he investigates how victim, competition, and attention conflict shaped the notion of a culture of remembrance, and how solidarity and empathic remembrance can be an alternative to this. This year, his book, more than 10 years later, was published in German. In 2019, Rothberg published The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, and I will do an advertisement. The Implicated Subject, Multidirectional Memory, and I have not bought the German translation. I did not. Here it is. Here it is. And in your second, in the implicated subject, you explore the various ways of involvement other than as a perpetrator, victim, or bystander, extending this involvement in space and time. It's an honor and a privilege to have you here, my dear Michael. Also an enormous honor, my former colleague of the Jewish Museum, my museological partner in crime, Alina Gromova. And Alina Gromova is a museum professional and cultural anthropologist. And she will not speak on behalf of the Jewish Museum of Berlin tonight, but she will be talking out of the perspective of a museum thinker, and also because you are a board member of ICOM and also of the Committee of Collecting, COMCOM, so a museum practitioner and a museum a museum thinker and theoretist. We know each other from the Jewish Museum in Berlin, where Alina works as a scholar in the Museums Academy, and where diversity is one of her major broads of interest. In 2013, and that is also, I think, not uninteresting for our conversation tonight, she published her book, Kosher Light, and unfortunately I have it in my bookshelf somewhere else and not here in my office. Otherwise I would have also showed that book. And it's the result of your PhD research on the lifestyle of young Jews of Russian descent in Berlin. So an expert on Jewish contemporary life, and an expert on museums and how museums should be. Wonderful that you are here with me tonight. Michael, you are a well-known participant in the current debate on the relation between Holocaust studies and post-colonial studies. The concept of multidirectional memory is developed as a strategy to go beyond competitive memory. And in your comparative studies, you introduced the concept of implicated subject to go beyond this classical distinction between victors, perpetrators, and bystanders. The two concepts, multidirectional memory and implicated subjects, were very, very important in the development of our exhibition. That's why you're here tonight. And not in the least, and I hope we can reflect upon that as well when we start to talk, not in the least because as museum, we are implicated in what we show. For example, in connection with the colonial origin of a major part of our collection, the collection that I'm now responsible for. We, as present day professionals, we are not perpetrators per se burdened with that guilt, but we are certainly are implicated with a responsibility, I think, that goes with it. Michael, I asked you, although you are my guest in my living room, to open our tonight's conversation with an input, which is probably a bit strange for you, because when you're invited to somebody's living room, you're not really going to talk for 20 minutes. But I'm going to ask you anyway if you would be the one who kicks off this evening, and then I would say the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be part of this, in a virtual way, at least this fascinating, what sounds like a fascinating exhibition. I'm sorry that I actually can't see it in person, but I'm grateful to Léontine for inviting me and making me part of this. And it's great to be in conversation also with Alina, who I met about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, at an event at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. So I have good memories of that too. Yes, Léontine asked me to speak for about 20 minutes. I wouldn't normally do this in somebody's living room. Feel free to interrupt me if I go on too long. And she asked me to speak about my last two books, Multidirectional Memory and The Implicated Subject. I think actually, I'll say also, and maybe we can talk about this later, though we don't need to, my first book, Traumatic Realism, I think is also relevant to the exhibit, especially these kind of paradoxes of speech and speechlessness. Is what I had in mind when I came up with the notion of traumatic realism. And I know some of the figures who are included in your Diskursbuch, like Ruth Kluger, were important to me when I was writing that book as well. But I will focus on the other two books for now. And these are linked books, though there is definitely some significant changes of emphasis when we move from multidirectional memory to the implicated subject. I started writing Multidirectional Memory, it's 20 years or more now. It's just appeared in German, but the actual work on it began at the beginning, really the beginning of the century. And I realized recently that what I was responding to was really the responses that had come to the globalization of Holocaust memory that took place, especially in the first decade after the end of the Cold War. Right? So especially in the US, but not uniquely there. And of course, you can go back and talk about the kind of spread globalization of Holocaust memory. You could go back to 1961 and talk about the Eichmann trial. You could talk about 1978 and 79 with the Holocaust miniseries, which both of those things had huge impact, both in the US and in Germany and in other places. But definitely something happened post-89. Right, a lot of things happened post-89 that brought a kind of qualitative change to the presence of Holocaust memory and Holocaust consciousness, not everywhere in the world, but in many places around the world, certainly Western Europe, North America, Israel, let's say. And the responses to that globalization, I started to realize at a certain moment, seemed diametrically opposed, but I came to realize had a kind of uncommon underlying logic. So what you saw was prompted by this spread, this increasing visibility of the Holocaust. Think about Schindler's List, think about the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Those are sort of American examples. But this prompted some people to worry that this increased presence of the Holocaust was in fact blocking other histories from being remembered, from becoming visible in the public sphere. In the US, I think those discussions were especially about slavery, right, and the history and memory of slavery, which it was felt were being kind of pushed out of the frame by the prominence of the Holocaust. In other places like France, I think it was more about colonialism, for example. But these were fairly common concerns, worries that were being articulated, and they prompted in turn, or simultaneously, a kind of mirror reflection, which is that people who were interested in, who were sort of promoting, let's say, these new forms of Holocaust memory, were worried themselves that if these other histories started to come into the picture, that the Holocaust would be relativized, that the Holocaust would be denied, that the Holocaust would not have the space for remembrance that it deserves as the kind of event that it is. And what I came to realize is that these two opposed responses shared a common logic. And that was what I came to see as the logic of the zero-sum game, and which I also called competitive memory, a kind of shift from this notion of the competition of victims, which was very present also at that moment. I think it's a somewhat problematic concept. We could always talk more about that. But there was an element of competition. I called it competitive memory. And the idea, this zero-sum logic, was that the presence of one collective memory sort of displaces the memories of other events. And that really you could only remember one thing at a time. So if you were remembering the Holocaust, that means you were not remembering slavery. If you were remembering colonialism, you couldn't also be remembering Holocaust. And this was common to the different sides of this debate that was going on there. But what I came to see is that if you sort of zoomed out a little bit from the perspective of the participants and looked at it from a more global perspective, as it were, that's not really the way that public memory works. That in fact, what you find is what I came to identify as a productive logic, right? So it was, in fact, at the very moment that we were talking more about the Holocaust, which I think was objectively true, we actually also started to talk more about slavery. We started to talk more about colonialism. And I would say the opposite is true too. The more then we came to talk about slavery and colonialism, the more we also continued to talk about the Holocaust. And I think if you look at the German debate right now, we can come back to that, that's exactly what you see, right? You see a kind of proliferation of discourses, a proliferation of memories. It doesn't mean that all memories are equal, that the public sphere is somehow neutral and everybody has equal access. That's obviously not true. There's a lot of factors that have to be included here, but the underlying logic is this kind of dynamic, productive logic whereby we end up with more memory and not less memory, and more memory of different kinds of histories. And it's that logic, that dynamic, that evolution of memories in dialogue with each other, in exchange with each other, which is what I called multidirectionality. And my first argument in the book is then, this is in fact the way that memory works, especially in public spaces. It works dialogically, it works productively, and not in this privative zero-sum logic, which I think a lot of people at the time, and I think a lot of people still today believe it is in effect. And I took then two sort of further correlates from that first argument about multidirectionality. And the first one, I wasn't thinking about museums when I wrote this. I'm not an expert in museums, but I think it's relevant to museums. And I think your exhibit perhaps bears this out. And that was the idea that we need to reconsider the way we write the history of memories, or perhaps stage them, right, in museological terms. And we need to write more entangled histories of, for instance, in my case, right, Holocaust memory, along with responses to colonialism, along with responses to slavery. Now, of course, other combinations are possible, right? This happened to be my interest, coming from Holocaust studies, having these other interests in African-American studies, as Léontine mentioned, in post-colonial studies. It's also not an arbitrary choice. I think that there is a real constellation that exists in the world, as I'll say more about in a moment. But I think this can also be transported to other contexts, and we can think about those kinds of interactions in ways that have nothing to do with the Holocaust or have nothing to do with colonialism or slavery or what have you. It's a sort of underlying structure that to me is present in a lot of different contexts. But as I did my work on the book, and this was not something I knew coming into it, it's really what I discovered in the course of my work, there is a real tradition that goes all the way back to the beginning of the post-war period, and I think you can trace it even back further in some ways, of people thinking about the relationship between the Nazi genocide of European Jews and other forms of Nazi violence and the history of European colonialism and the history of transatlantic slavery. And I would never claim this was a mainstream position exactly. It's not a continuous tradition. It goes in a lot of different directions. It's not a majority position, but it does include some of the most prominent thinkers of the second half of the 20th century. So I start with Hannah Arendt and Aimé Césaire. I include writers like the French Jewish writer André Schwarz-Bart, intellectuals like the great African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois. These are really important cultural figures, really important intellectuals. And from the very beginning of the post-war period, they were thinking in these relational terms. How did what was becoming known as the Holocaust in that period relate to, intersect with these other histories of violence? So that's sort of my second point, is a kind of methodological point that I took as a scholar, but I think would also be relevant in museum exhibitions, for instance. And my third point was that this led me to want to rethink the relationship between memory and identity. I think often it is assumed that memories are the property of particular groups. So it's Jews who own the memory of the Holocaust, or maybe Germans today who own the memory of the Holocaust. It's Black people who own the memory of slavery. Now, these are tricky questions, obviously, and of course, those various groups do have very specific connections to those histories, and I'm not trying to deny that. But I think what I came to see is that this assumption that there are pre-existing groups that then have memories that there are property is flawed, that actually memory and group identity evolve together, and that the relationship between them is much more performative. In other words, that groups are called into being through the kinds of memories that they enact. And if memories are then multidirectional, involved in these kinds of exchanges, it seems to me that identities are also more open-ended and dynamic and changing than sometimes we assume when we study collective memory or when we talk about cultural production in general. So I think some of the positions that I hold sometimes get confused with identity politics, and I don't deny the importance of identity politics, but the notion of identity that's involved is a much more dynamic one, and a much more ambivalent one in certain ways than I think is sometimes asserted or assumed. So those are really the core arguments of multidirectional memory. And when I finished the book, some of the questions that I was getting is, well, that all sounds interesting, but, are all forms of multidirectional memory the same? What about differences between different kinds of multidirectional memory? And I thought, yeah, that's something that I haven't really adequately theorized or conceptualized in the book. So I wrote an essay, and it's actually the essay that you guys included in your discourse book called From Gaza to Warsaw, where I picked up on this very common and very controversial, of course, kind of explosive analogy comparison that's often made between the Holocaust and, say, the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And I tried to take that as a very difficult example to sort through some of the different varieties of Holocaust memory. And we can talk more about that later if you'd like. But I also, at the same time, started to wonder about the different ways that different histories and memories intersect. What I mean by that is, in multidirectional memory, what I was primarily interested in was the way that these various intellectuals I mentioned, say Du Bois or Césaire, or Schwarzbart especially, but others as well, were linking different histories of victimization, right? So that the multidirectional links between the different histories often went through the category of victimization, so that these are shared experiences of being victims of extreme violence, of genocide, of political violence of different sorts. And I began to wonder, well, what about other subject positions, right? What about people who are not victims? How do they relate to this multiplicity of histories? And I wrote an essay about the great writer W.G. Sebald and his book Austerlitz, and paired him with the really, for me, fascinating, wonderful South African Jewish artist, William Kentridge, and his film series, Drawings for Projection. And both of these artists, writers, are extremely multidirectional, right? If you've read Austerlitz, you know that it refers to almost every possible, form of violence in Western modernity. If you see Kentridge's films, you'll see apartheid, you'll see the Holocaust, you'll see slavery. But what fascinated me was that they weren't doing that. They weren't organizing those multidirectional connections from the position of the victim, but rather from this other position that I came to call the implicated subject, right? Someone who is involved in these histories, who is responsible in some ways, but not necessarily as a direct participant, right? Someone like Sebald, born after the war, but still obviously thinking through his responsibility as a German for the Holocaust, but also, again, for colonialism, for other things. So this led me to the new project, which became eventually the implicated subject. And it also had, we were chatting a little bit before we started, I was asked, does this have something to do with you personally? And yes, it does. It very much does. I realized, it didn't start that way, I think, but I realized pretty quickly that in trying to think about these forms of indirect responsibility that I call implication, this was partly an autobiographical project. And I don't write particularly autobiographically, but it's the investment is clear for me, which is that I was trying to figure out my relationship as a white Jewish man in 21st century United States, what was my relationship to those founding crimes, as we often call them, of the United States, the genocide of indigenous people, the enslavement of Africans, right? And obviously, I wasn't alive when these sort of core events were taking place. In fact, my family immigrated from Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, after slavery had ended, right after the conquest of North America had taken place. But it was very clear to me that despite not being there myself, despite not having a family connection exactly to those things, that I still bore a kind of indirect responsibility for them, or even a direct responsibility, but one which couldn't be described in the vocabulary of victims and perpetrators alone. And that's what led me eventually to the new book. And I was sort of helped on the way, actually, by my work in Holocaust studies, and particularly reading Karl Jaspers' The Question of German Guilt, Die Schuldfrage, was a very important text for me because of the way that he distinguishes between different versions of what he calls guilt: criminal guilt, political guilt, moral guilt, and metaphysical guilt. And it was particularly the categories of political guilt and to an extent moral guilt that became very important to me in their distinction from criminal guilt, right? So criminal guilt is the guilt of the perpetrator, the guilt of the person who actually commits a crime. What I was interested in is what he calls, especially was what he calls political guilt. But I also became, which is your guilt by virtue of being the member of a collective, right? So by virtue of being a German who was alive during the National Socialist period, you bear a kind of guilt, according to Jaspers, and that's what he was trying to convey to his listeners when he was giving those lectures. The word guilt seemed wrong to me in that instance, and that's where Hannah Arendt was useful in talking about responsibility and collective responsibility. So I would make a distinction between criminal guilt on the one hand, and then political and moral responsibility on the other hand. And it's those categories of responsibility that really interested me. So I propose in my book this category of the implicated subject, which is not meant to erase victims and perpetrators, who obviously have to be kept in the picture too, if we're talking about political violence especially, but it is a kind of a substitute for the notion of the bystander. The bystander for me is a weak term because it implies a kind of passivity and detachment, which I think doesn't capture what I was trying to get at, which is that you can be quite involved even if you're not a perpetrator, right? In the perpetration of some of these crimes. And so what I'm interested in, what I describe as implicated subjects, are those of us, and many of us are in these positions often or at different times, who enable violence, who benefit from violence, who perpetuate violence, who inherit some sort of responsibility for past violence. Again, the sort of second, third, fourth generation German is the classic topos, I think, of that sort of inherited responsibility. And that's, that's important to me, though but it applies in other contexts as well, like my own. That's what I was trying to work out. Let me say a couple more points and then maybe turn it back to you guys. So once I had this notion of the implicated subject, this indirect participant in histories and actualities of violence takes different forms: the beneficiary, the perpetuator, as I call that figure, the enabler, etc. I also make then a distinction between what I call diachronic implication and synchronic implication. Diachronic implication is precisely the way that we are involved in histories that precede us, right? So what's my relationship to transatlantic slavery? What's a young German's relationship to the Holocaust today? That's what I call diachronic implication. The events in some sense are over, but some kind of responsibility, moral or political, lives on. And I distinguish that from what I call synchronic implication. That's the way we're implicated in events that are unfolding today. So let's say the way that many of us benefit from sweatshop labor taking place far from us, or really the global capitalist system as a whole, right? We're not perpetrating capitalism, but through our consumption, et cetera, we are participating and we are enabling what's going on far from us, even if we never see it, even if we never really know what is going on there. So that's a version of what I call synchronic implication. And these things are often entangled. So you can be a beneficiary of something in the past, but you can be a beneficiary of something that's happening in the present. Sometimes I think it's even totally impossible to unravel. Those of us who live in settler colonial contexts are what I call perpetuators. The initial conquest might have taken place hundreds of years ago, but it's being repeated every day, right? So it's both synchronic and diachronic. And so we're in this kind of temporal gray zone, I suppose, of perpetuation. Now, I hope it's clear already that I think that many of us are also are situated in different relations to different histories, right? So as a Jewish person, even though my family emigrated to the US before the Holocaust, I inherit a legacy of anti-Semitism, a memory of the Holocaust, a sense that a vulnerability, right, a victimization that Jews have experienced for centuries, that we continue to experience in certain contexts. So on the one hand, I have links to these histories of victimization. On the other hand, I am, again, as I was trying to describe, implicated in, as a white American, in these other crimes that have taken place and inequalities that continue to exist. And when you have those kind of lines to different positions of, on the one hand, perpetration, on the other hand, victimization, that is what I call complex implication. We talk a lot about complexity, but I mean in a very particular way. I mean precisely that we're situated in relationship both to histories of victimization and histories of perpetration. And I think this is in fact very common, right? Because we all have complex identities of different sorts, gendered, racialized, et cetera, et cetera. And I also think, I'll just end on this point, that this is often one of the kind of sticking points in political struggles. And is that people feel themselves torn between these different positions. And that's cognitively kind of difficult, I think, sometimes to wrap your mind around. But I guess what I'm trying to do in the book is to provide a vocabulary that helps us to sort through some of those sorts of cases, to make sense of them, and to recognize that we can be on the one hand, inherit these, what Mariana Hirsch would call post-memories of the Holocaust, for example, and at the same time still be responsible in the present for other forms of oppression and domination that are going on. And the one doesn't cancel out the other. And so again, I guess it's a sort of refusal of the zero-sum logic, right? That being a victim in one situation doesn't mean you can't also be implicated in another. So maybe that's one of the links between the two books. But let me stop there. I think that was long enough and we can go on.
Ooh. I could listen to you for hours and hours.
I won't inflict that on you, though.
Because what you open up is so interesting and so stimulating. So you could have talked for hours and minutes, but Alina is also here. Alina, as my other guest of this wonderful living room setting tonight or this morning in Michael's context, do you want to respond directly to what Michael has been giving us as an input?
Yes, of course. I'm very happy to be able to respond. First of all, it's really beautiful to think of a Zoom as a living room. It gives a lot of warmth and emotion into this internet meetings, and I'm very happy to be here, and also very happy to see Michael again after I think 5 or 6 years after we were lucky to welcome you to the Academy of the Jewish Museum. And you mentioned many things which I would like to refer to, and what moved me especially is your referring to the notion of identity, and that you realized during the work of your process that identity is something very dynamic and also something very ambiguous, because this is actually the work of anthropologist, and I'm a cultural and urban anthropologist, that we realized during our work that there is no black and white, there is no real and non-real, and there is everything is situational, everything is dependent on the context and also on the person who is in front of you, who you are talking about. And this was a very important thing or theory which I used when working on my book Generation Kosher Light and working with young migrants from the former Jewish migrants from the former Soviet Union, where I also realized that when they link their identity to other groups, and this was about Berlin, so it is about the city space. In Berlin, you have many groups. You have when you speak about migration context, you have the Jews from the former Soviet Union. You have the so-called the Germans from the former Soviet Union. You have people from various Muslim countries, and all these interactions in the city space. So what you see is that you cannot say that when a Jew meets a German from the former Soviet Union, that there is one kind of interaction or identity construction. And when a Jew meets a Muslim, there is another kind of identity construction. So it was, everything was in flow, and everything was, and this ambiguous identity was what struck me a lot. And also what I found out that links between these groups went very often through victimization. This is also a point which you mentioned, that when people wanted to relate to another group who also undergone migration, and I'm not talking here about some specific contexts, also not about post-colonial or Holocaust context, but various kinds of traumata which goes along with migration. The process of victimization was very strong, and this was actually it was very difficult to grasp it. And then what I found was what was space, right? Because we are in the city context, and space is something which is physical and which you can grasp, which you can read, and identity was something which was difficult to grasp. So I really like to think about identities in terms of spaces, various spaces which are in the same, maybe in the same room or in the same place, and they're interacting, and and then they're going forward, and then there is another kind of history. And so this interaction is changing all the time. And this fluidity and ambiguity is something which really struck me also in your work. So maybe just to refer to only this context, but there are also a lot of other concepts which I really fond of.
Thank you, Alina. You both touch on self-reflexivity in a way, especially also in your thesis, in your book. It's not sufficient, but I think it's necessary, and I think you both agree on that for collision building, and building on what Michael said. I think our professional work is to some extent always inspired or driven by our personal biography. You were very explicit in this before, Michael, and thank you so much for that. So I would like to bring in that concept of positionality. And what is the role or the possible role of positionality in all of this? Is positionality a way to make the hybridity of social structures and the place of every individual subject visible? Or does it reproduce positions of victims and perpetrators? And how was that in your research, Alina? Maybe you can both reflect a bit on that.
Alina, do you want to start, or?
Michael, go on, because this notion of implicated subjects and victims and perpetrators, I need to think a little bit to translate it onto my research. So
sure. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Sure, happy to start. Yeah, there's a lot there, and also a lot in what Alina just said in her first remarks that maybe I can connect to eventually. I mean, in
Please
terms of
do.
position, yeah, in terms of positionality and identity politics, I mean, what I was just trying to describe at the end of my remarks about the implicated subject is, and this notion of complex implication is, I hope, an indication of, where the direction that I would want to go in, which is that I do think our positioning is important. I do think our different identities are important, but I think those identities are complex in some of the ways that I described. And in the implicated subject, one of the important theoretical resources, which again, I didn't necessarily expect at the beginning when I set out to write the book, but kind of discovered or rediscovered along the way, was the manifesto of the Combahee River Collective, right, which was a collective of Black women writing in the late 70s. And it's come back into a lot of discussions recently around questions of identity, around critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm glad it is, because I think it's a very, very important document and very important theory that they offer. And it's actually the place where the phrase identity politics emerged initially. So they're really the first, as far as I know, at least, they're the first ones to use this concept of identity politics. And what they meant was basically that as Black women, we feel we should have an opportunity to speak about those issues that concern us. And it seems to me that's a really hard position to refute, right? So there's a lot of hand-wringing about identity politics, but in its origins, at least, it was making, I think, a really important point that these are a set of experiences that often get erased, that often get marginalized, and we believe that we should be able to speak from our positions about those things. The Combahee River Collective statement is partly famous for introducing the concept of identity politics, but I think it also does lead us to a really interesting and complicated notion of positionality and identity, in fact. And so the other thing they're really famous for is their notion of interlocking systems of domination, right? That this is a theory of interlocking systems of domination, which would later be called intersectionality, another key term of the present debates, which is often misunderstood, right? But they didn't use that term.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, very badly misunderstood, I would say. They don't use that term, but they provide the kind of base theory for it. And I think it's a really important one. So let's just say what it is. What they were trying to point out was, again, as Black women, they experience different systems of domination simultaneously and in an interlocking way that you can't simply separate out. So that gender is racialized, that race is gendered, that all of these things are imbued with class, that sexuality plays a role there as well. And they were trying to think that that interlocking set, that intersectional set of forms of domination, think the simultaneity of those. And because of the position from which they are starting, and because of the immediate concerns that they had, which again, I think are totally legitimate, they were primarily trying to think that system, those interlocking systems, from the position of those who are, let's say, multiply oppressed or oppressed by different systems simultaneously. Again, I think that's totally important and legitimate, but what I came to realize as I was rereading the text in relation to my notion of the implicated subject was that there's also a theory of implication there, or even more of complex implication there. Because if these systems are interlocking, race, gender, class, let's say, we're not all going to be positioned by those in the same way, right? So that as Black women, they are perhaps at the kind of like apex of these different systems, but as they say, we still need to work with other people in coalitions, right? If we want to change these systems, we need to work with other people. And that means engaging, on the one hand, this is what they say, with white women, even though they are invested in white supremacy, structurally and often personally. We also have to work with Black men who share an experience of racialization with us, but are also beneficiaries of patriarchy, right? And so you see there, when you sort of start to move through their theory, to me at least, what they're doing is offering also a theory of implication, right? The way that Black men can be, on the one hand, victimized, if you will, oppressed by racial structures, systemic structural racism, but at the same time invested in certain ways in patriarchy. Same with white women, reverse terms. And so it's actually a theory, not just of intersectionality, but a theory of complex implication. And to me, this was, really inspiring and a really important component of what I was trying to think through. And I hope that's useful then for thinking about what we mean by positionality. We're positioned in multiple ways. Those multiple ways, as we experience them, are simultaneous and overlapping, and in some ways inseparable. But these different systems of domination create different patterns of implication and different patterns of positionality. And we need to kind of be able to move and take into account those different positions when we're analyzing different social phenomena, I guess I would say.
Can I jump in before I give the mic back to Alina? How does it function or not function in a system called museum, which is, state funded? In my case, it is in that sense less, or maybe it can be. Does it open in the same way as for a specific person? What is the difference between the system, the institution, and an individual person? Or is it always the individual person in the institution? Michael.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
That was for Alina. I was hoping that question was for Alina.
Okay, well, okay. I can also give but maybe you can start and then Alina take over.
Yeah, I think I would probably, I don't think that system and institution are necessarily synonyms or necessarily identical, though I suppose they're probably overlapping. I think it's true that institutions are frequently the sites of our own implication, right? Mm-hmm. So I think as a curator, you are implicated by virtue of belonging to a particular kind of institution with a particular history and a particular actuality, right? I think as a university professor, I am implicated in the educational institution, and that comes with, good things, I think, for sure, but it also puts us in particular kinds of histories as well. In the United States, for example, there's been a lot of discussion and action also around the way that universities were implicated in the slave trade, for example, right? So a lot of universities have started to write reports, kind of like you have those reports of, German corporations and their relationship to National Socialism. It's now Brown University or Harvard University and the slave trade. And I think those are really important gestures, more than gestures. And some places have started to also, make certain kinds of reparation because of those kinds of implication. Those of us who are in land grant institutions like I am, where did this land come from? This land was stolen from indigenous people. So we are implicated in that history as well. So I do think, I guess what I would say is certainly institutions are sites that produce implication, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does play a huge role in this exhibition, where we reflect a lot about our own positionality and link it indeed to reparation, which of course implies restitution, but it is of course so much more. Alina, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I will try to come to what Michael just, as next as possible to what Michael just said about the positionality, and I will refer to my own research and also to some projects and what are the fundings. What I realized when working with identity and spaces and also interaction with different identities and different memories and the linkage is that there is always a group which which has this standing of feeling being a victim on the one side and not a victim on the other side. So I think these two sides are always there. There is no one or another. And for example, my research in Berlin showed that if you have a group of, for example, Ashkenazi Jews from the former Soviet Union who feel that their story is not visible enough in Germany or in the German Jewish national narrative, then there is also another group which is going next to become to become a victim, because no one wants to be a victim, right? It doesn't feel good to stand up and to say, well, my story. I mean, it is different today. I would say there are more and more museums who present beautiful stories and beautiful objects of various groups which used to be marginalized. But it is still there are still a lot of things which are not visible. And for example, you have an Ashkenazi group which is looking for someone else, and this someone else is, for example, Jews from Caucasus or Central Asia who came to Germany, which are looked upon and which are said to be not European enough, not civilized enough, backward. All this, all these cliches which people want to get rid of. And then there is a next group, a group of, for example, Muslim people, not Jewish people, who become the next victim. So this is going on and on and on. And also I'm working right now on a project on Jews along the Silk Road. And it is about Jews from Caucasus and Central Asia, but also Jews from Morocco and Turkey, for example. And I realized that also these groups, people from Ukraine or Russia who went to Caucasus in the 50s or during the war or during the evacuation, they look down on the local population, right? And at the same time, the local population also looks down at them. So there are always this both sides, and you cannot say you're on the one side or another. And what the institutions are concerned, and especially the museums, I mean, I think it is very complicated because museums are so diverse today, and
thank God.
Yes, and they're becoming more and more diverse. And there are, of course, museums which have very violent history and a very colonial history. But there are also museums who, like a museum of documentation center and museum for immigration, DOMIT in Colonia, which was born out of the initiative of migrants who decided to collect their objects. And there are also small museums which work with certain, like a district museums. Right, which are of course also connected to the broader history and to brighter history, but also are very much connected to the local population. And so I think it is becoming difficult, more and more difficult to talk about museums in general. It is also what I realize being part of the ICOM family, where we always have fight between, are we talking about the large ethnographical museums, or are we talking about small village museums consisting of one or two people, because they all are museums. There are also wild museums where everyone is volunteering, and community museums.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. One comment from my side, or an opening up. from a Dutch museological perspective is that in the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, there's already for a longer time, and I don't think they read your book. I will ask them next time when I see them. It's a Jewish historical museum that reflects very much on the history of the Jews in the Netherlands and of course also the Shoah. But more and more, this museum is also dealing with the history of slavery in Suriname and the Dutch Jewish involvement in that. So you have in the one museum a narrative of victims of the Shoah and anti-Semitism in the Netherlands, but also a history of being a perpetrator and an active participant in the slave trade. And I find it interesting that every time when I talk about that in Germany, people just don't know how to react because they feel very uncomfortable when I say this. So it's very, very, very interesting. Hey, we have some questions. I am so happy that we have some questions. Thank you for the one who, Elizabeth Freeman is with us tonight. Thanks for watching us. And you start with a compliment. Thank you for the panel to everyone. Hey, that's cool. Michael, this one goes to you. The multi-directional memory and implicated subject are so helpful terms. Thank you so much for that. Could you elaborate, please, on the necessity of diachronic implications in struggle with the political violence of chromonormative order? Wow. Do you want to reflect on that immediately, or do you want a moment to digest on that?
Could you repeat the last part of the question?
Yes, of course. Could you elaborate, please, on the necessity of, well, now I have to scroll. Could you elaborate, please, on the necessity of diachronic implications in struggle with the political violence of chromonormative order?
I guess I'm not entirely sure what that last phrase means. Chrononormative order. I mean, a particular organization of time that is itself a form of violence. Perhaps that's what the question is getting at. I think that's really interesting. I mean, I guess I haven't thought about it in quite those terms, but I think if I'm understanding correctly, maybe that there is a tension between a certain kind of, I don't know, progressive temporality, if this is what the chrononormative is, and the notion of the diachronic.
She goes, thank you so much, Elizabeth. What methods, if possible, could we think of that are able to unsettle this normative order of time in structural terms? Epistemological intervention, intersection is one important part. But what about the structural ignorance? Could or how would the juridical political dimension play a role?
That is a complex question. I think I might need to think more about that and maybe come back to that a little bit.
Okay. Alina, your thoughts on that?
Not really, because I think it really refers to the terminology which Michael is using. So yeah, let me also digest on this.
Okay, maybe I can jump in with a question which relates to the concept of community, which is very important in my everyday work. Different communities that we deal with, and I know it's also important for the work of Alina. And in a conference of the Memory Studies Association, dear Michael, 2 weeks ago, you had a short discussion with Erika Lehrer about the role of museums and museum professionals. And that was very, very interesting. So you see, I did my homework. And she, of course, with her implicated communities, very much bases her concept on your work. And I noticed that you don't really specifically use the word community, so the community of implication. You use the group, and you also specifically don't use it for victims, but more the other context. Is there a reason why you don't use the word community? And is it something that we need to think about in museums? Do we need to move beyond that concept? Or are you actually, Erika, and you very much talking about the same thing? I'm also mentioning that because Erika Lehrer was on the panel before this one.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I'm a big fan of Erika's work. I say that up front, and so I think this notion of communities of implication seems very productive to me. It's true, I suppose, I don't use the concept of community very often. I think that community for me too often implies a certain homogeneity and extreme localness. And I know that it can mean different things, and when it exists, in existence, is of course very different. But perhaps because I'm working more with texts and less with ethnographic methodologies, it's not a term that I talk so much about. I think that maybe one place, one rethinking of community that was important to me and was useful for me in another project, which intersects with some of Alina's concerns, which was about migration and memory, was a distinction that the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy makes between common being and being in common as ways of thinking about community. And I think it's this notion of community as possessing a kind of common being that is what makes it troublesome for me, and that this is often the way it's used, at least like in American discourse, in American politics. It can be a very conservative term because it implies a certain kind of homogenous community of people who are all the same, right? And so that's a kind of violence there. But I like Nancy's notion of being in common as opposed to common being, is that it's about that kind of proximity in space that Alina was also talking about, I think, in some of her examples, her ethnographic examples, but doesn't imply a commonality of essence. And so that notion of a kind of heterogeneous, open-ended community of being in common is one that I find productive. In terms of, one of the things that I think you sponsored or maybe commissioned, Léontine, in relation to some of your exhibits was this project, I've forgotten the artist's name, Vermisst in Benin.
Yeah, Emeka Ogbo.
Yeah, Ogbo, yeah, which I thought was a really great project. And
thank you.
And one of the things I liked about it was precisely, I think it resonates with Erika's notion there of communities of implication, because what I saw was, so these were these posters that appeared in bus, Haltestelle, whatever bus stops, whatever those are called, with images of the Benin bronzes, where it says "Vermisst in Benin," right? Missing posters, as it were, for these looted artworks, these looted cultural works. And what struck me about them was that they're precisely addressing the community, right? They're addressing the community as a community of implicated subjects, right? So they're not saying you stole this. You may or may not even go to the museum, but in some sense, the implication for me was that you are a beneficiary of this history of colonial violence. You can go to the museum and see these beautiful and important works. And that is that makes you a kind of beneficiary of colonial violence, whether you realize it or not. So it was a kind of address to the community, and an address that was meant to produce a sense of implication by virtue of your belonging to a community. So I guess I can certainly see how it can be a useful concept, or is a useful concept in the museum context. but it does, I think, again, the concept has, at least in the American sense, and I think you have that in German probably too, the risk of reinforcing a certain homogenized notion of who are the interested people in a particular location, right? That they all correspond to a particular demographic, often white, often middle class, what have you. And so that's, I guess, what concerns me sometimes about the notion of community.
Yeah, and who speaks for the community. That's
Right.
of course also a huge topic that Alina will not go into tonight. But Alina, can you jump onto what Michael was saying and the concept, the community of implication, Alina?
I'm still here.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and we see your beautiful picture.
Okay, I will be with you in a moment again. Hello again. I'm sorry.
Hello to the Baltic.
While Michael was speaking, I thought that your notion of community, Michael, or your thoughts community remind me very strongly what we just talked about, identity, right? So it also looks like it is very ambiguous, it is very fluid. And for me, I was, for a long time, I has been a big fan of the concept of community, because I saw also in terms of migration society and migration memories, I saw that in the moment when people feel being part of community, there is something strong starting growing, and there is a lot of power which is created, and there is this process of empowerment is very strongly connected to the community. And in the moment you feel part of the community, you get this positive vision of yourself and of your group or group reference. And there are a lot of people or a lot of groups which don't have this positive picture of this group. And I think so in this moment, probably it is not a community. So there is this interconnection between a linkage between community and empowerment. And but this is one side, right? This is the side of those who are willing to create community for a certain purpose. And this can be various purposes. I mean, the Nina Simon, whose work Léontine knows very, very well, who speaks about participation in museums. She says that community can be created around everything. It is not necessarily something to do with ethnicity or religion or culture. It can be people who meet in the laundry and coming there to wash their clothes, and they meet in this space and have a common interest, and they create a community for this certain moments. So it is situational, it is connected to space, and when they go out, this community disappears. And but then I started thinking about the term community more and more from the museological perspective. And I recently had a discussion on the term community in the context of COMCOL, of the ICOM Committee for Collecting, and we invited different people who work in museums and use different concepts, community, but also networking. There was a colleague from Amsterdam, from Imagine IC, and who is network curator. So this institution is working with networks, and they say, well, community is very homogeneous, and we have different people with different interests from different parts of the world, which not necessarily create a community, but they have a network. So I realized, speaking to people and addressing them as a community and asking, is your community interested in cooperating with museums? So you realize that people are not always very fond of being addressed as a community, right? Because you think on your site, in your holy museum, that there are some communities somewhere outside which you need to find and to bring inside the museum, but I also think that the word community is something which sometimes covers other important issues or topics, right? For example, marginalized groups often fight for social equality, for recognition, for visibility. And when we address this as community, or them as community has something nice in, I'm not sure how it is in English-speaking discourse, but when you use the word community in the German language, it is a group of people coming together, being understanding each other, sharing values, and but these values are often very not always people fighting for something, right? They're lacking something, and I think the term community does not show or disclose very often these values.
Yeah, well, that's why for me, as now the director of an ethnological museum, is the implicated community perspective of Erika so enormously enriching. And Michael, thank you for referring to the MEK Opbouw action we did in Dresden at the beginning of this year. Because this direct addressing the implicatedness of the German civil society, or at least the Dresdner, the people inhabiting Dresden, created also a lot of uncomfortableness with a lot of people, because they were directly addressed as part of this colonial project. And there's one question. The question that wants to think about the conditions for decolonization, and I think this reflection for also the people outside of my museum wall, that this Benin bronzes being here in Dresden is also their implicatedness, and that we all have a responsibility in order to repair that. So I'm very thankful that you reflected on that, although it does not have in that sense anything to do with the exhibition that we show now. We had this wonderful but very layered question before. Do you still want to jump into that, or shall I ask another question? Because there is another question as well from the public. I'm not sure.
The question you mentioned before, I think it would really it helped if we can read it, because it is a beautiful question, but it has so many parts. It makes it difficult to answer the whole question. So maybe we maybe we choose one part of this question, or maybe we go on with the next question. And
okay, shall I then jump on to the next question? Okay.
Sure.
All of you talked a lot about how specific artists, artworks, or museums, exhibitions make use of the notion of the implicated subject. For instance, Sebald and Kentridge help us understand how to get from the position of victimization to implication being implicated. My question is how to tackle with this problem beyond specific artworks. So can aesthetic experiences or the agency of art in general help us as regards to understand multidirectional memory? Well, Michael.
That sounds like it implicates me. Yeah, I mean, here it's partly a matter of disciplinary training, and personal predilection. I mean, as a literary critic, trained as a literary critic and interested more broadly in art and film and this sort of thing, I tend to think through close engagement with works of art, works of literature and art. And so for me, those are precisely ways of thinking, of theorizing, of conceptualizing, that are, very much connected to material conditions that we're all interested in, that we're interested in transforming, but are, first of all, I think, opportunities for thinking. And I think that obviously there's no straight line from aesthetic experience, aesthetic reflection of this sort to, let's say, social political action. I don't think it goes that directly. And I certainly don't claim that it does, or that I have the answer of how to make that link in any simple or direct way. I guess what I see my work doing primarily is trying to provide a vocabulary through engagement, sometimes with works of art or through works of philosophy or theory or whatever, because I work across these different domains, but trying to provide concepts, trying to provide analytic categories that can help us explain, make sense of our experience, the problems that interest us, which are going to be different for different people, of course, and we're differently located, have different struggles, but that these concepts can potentially travel at least some distance across domains, can be illuminating, and perhaps through that can help to inspire certain forms of action. I mean, I know that, I've had some interaction over the years, both after the publication of Multidirectional Memory and now again, somewhat after the publication of The Implicated Subject, with people, on the one hand, sometimes with artists who say, oh, this is actually really inspiring for my artwork. I see how I can use these concepts to produce art. So there's a kind of taking from artworks and going back into artworks in new ways. And then, with Implicated Subject, but then I've also had sort of young Jewish activists come to me and say, who are engaged, let's say, either with protest against, immigration policies in the US, that was a lot during the Trump era, or let's say the politics of Israel and Palestine, right? Who are people, young Jewish activists who are critical of Israeli policies, practices, the occupation, what have you, and trying to think about ways to mobilize some of these concepts in activist work. And I think it can be done, and I'm excited to see that people do that. Again, there's not always a direct line. It's not always easy. I don't know if it works ultimately, but I do think there's something, but it has always felt to me that there was something natural about that, right? Again, it goes back in a way to our discussion of positionality, that when we take part in activist projects, we don't leave our multiple identities behind. We somehow engage them and need to mobilize them. And so if you are coming to one of these political crises or struggles as in someone who identifies as Jewish, it seems to me natural that you're going to be drawing on the memories of the Holocaust, for example, when you oppose the building of concentration camps on the border for migrants from Central America, or when you see things that are happening in Palestine, for example. It doesn't mean that these things are the same. Certainly, I'm not saying they're the same. People might sometimes, that's sort of up to them. But I think they still sometimes have a power as mobilizing metaphors, that these are the histories of injustice that we have inherited. And of course, we're going to make use of them when we confront new injustices. And there are better and worse ways to do that, of course. That's another question, and an important question. But it seems to me that that these concepts can be inspiring for some of those sorts of political projects as well as other artistic projects. And there's a kind of, I think we see that in a lot of domains, certainly not primarily in the ones that I'm in, but what other things that other people are doing too. There's a lot of movement and circulation between artistic practices, activism, and scholarly theoretical work. And I think that's a good thing myself.
Absolutely. Actually, one of my questions was the role of the scholar versus the role of the activist, and museums in the role of the scholar or in the activist? Is it either or? Is it end? How do you both position yourself in that spectrum? Although you might, dear Michael, already answered that question. Then I jump over to Alina.
Either way.
I can start, and then Michael, you can continue. I mean, this is I won't. I normally don't put it either or, like an opposition, but we can try and do it like an experiment and say we have a scientist on one side and activist on the other, and see what's coming out. I have in the last time very often heard, or I have the impression that more and more people try to write a big history. I'm not a historian, but I really love to listen to like a big historical overviews. And for example, with my project Jews Along the Silk Road, it's a road. It's a very, very bright project, right, which bridges half of the world, and more than half of the world. And what I realized that actually these bright historical overviews are very often missing. I won't say little, but they're missing stories, right? Not histories, but stories which are told from a personal perspective, from biographical perspective. And maybe I would put it on the side of activists. I became a big fan of podcasts, and there are more and more podcasts which are made, for example, in Germany, Rise and Shine, of two women which call themselves Asian women and speak from Asian perspective and tell stories, for example, of Vietnamese boat people. And these are very, very emotional stories which connect to body, which connect to feelings, to intimate moments. And I have the impression that while telling big stories and trying to embrace everything, and also trying to create a national narrative and national memory, it is on the other side, it's leaving out these intimate stories which give you very, very personal perspective of people. And I mean, museums have responsibility to create space for everyone, right? And but at the same time, there is always a question: do you want to offer something which everyone can relate to, or do you want to offer something for everyone, like a little bit for everyone? And I will say maybe there is difference. Maybe museums should start relating more to small stories, which we have to say, and become more activist in this way. Although this activism does not exclude scientific approach, of course, right? But so maybe this bridge between creating a big national story, is it possible, or creating something for everyone, right?
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with Alina that, this is not an either or, scholar versus activist. Obviously, you can be both. Obviously, there's a lot of crossover between the two. I mean, I do think that, the work that I do, I mean, these books at the very least, these are first of all scholarship, right? I mean, I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in activism. I'm thrilled if what I do can have, effects in the real world, as it were, beyond the academy. But I still see what I'm doing first as scholarly endeavors, right? And I try to think things through, and I don't think they have immediate, direct. You can't immediately and directly translate them necessarily into politics. There's mediation that has to take place between those. That said, when certain kinds of issues arise, I find myself, willingly pulled into certain kinds of activist interventions. I mean, which come out of, in a way, my scholarly intellectual concerns often. And so, it's the things that I feel like I have some expertise to to intervene are things that I have been thinking about, that I've been working on for a long time, and all of a sudden they become, let's say, hot button issues in the German public, and then I feel like, yeah, I have something to say about that, and it comes out of my scholarship, but I think it can be mobilized, if not in an activist way, at least in a civic kind of public way. And maybe that's another important third term also for museums, thinking about what we do as intellectuals, as cultural workers, as curators, as, these are contributions to the public sphere. These are forms of civic action, which I think are incredibly important. And that is a form of activism, as well. So yeah. Stop there for the moment.
Yeah, I think this has actually become more and more important, or should become more and more important for museum professionals, and also leading such an institution as I am now doing. And in a way, we try to do that, giving the floor to the Korea Foundation, to issue, to give space for this issue, and addressing the issue of comfort women and sexualized violence in never sexualized violence in Southeast Asia was very, very important, giving the space to activist groups or NGOs. I do think that being in an institution myself, and also being a director, I can't be myself an activist, but I can give space to activist voices. I do feel there's a shape shifting that has been going on since I'm now also in this position of power as director.
I think there's some sort of connection there also to being a teacher, right? Which is also what I am here, and this is also, students are part of my public, and I don't go into the classroom as an activist. For sure, I go in as a teacher, and I try to provide, again, knowledge and history and theories that will allow students then to become critical citizens and to make their own interventions, give them space and tools. But I certainly think it's important for me I don't feel it's productive and perhaps not ethical to go in there and say, I'm an activist and here's what we're going to do, rather, but open up thinking. And I think you have an important role that is similar, in the museum.
Mm-hmm. Also providing this methodological toolbox so that people can also very much, do it up, also in line with participatory work, create their own narratives and giving spaces, etc.
But on the other side, the question is also, what is activism? And I think we associate activism always with some rebel political actions, but I think activism is much more than that. And I think what, for example, the historical museum in Frankfurt on the Main is doing, working with city labs, where they create an exhibition or do a curatorial research in the city space together with people from this city. I will call this activism as well, because there is a museum together with people is looking for topics in the city which can be highly political or also ambiguous or historically marginalized. And in the moment you bring these topics into the exhibition, they become visible. And this is also activism work. This strong participatory or collaboratory work is also activist work for me. And more museums are doing this.
Oh, Alina, we have again your beautiful.
You lost me again.
Maybe that is a sort of sign from above that there is a starting point, and also a point when you say goodbye to your guests and go to bed. But before we end this wonderful and stimulating conversation, I have a question to Michael. Michael, in relation to the implicatedness of ethnological museums and addressing this multi-directional memories. What would you say to a museum director of an ethnological museum that is so implicated in colonial history, also very much in itself as an actor? What would you, as now the famous elevator pitch, what do you give me and all my colleagues working in the museum? What do you think we need to reflect upon or act upon or decide upon the next, well, actually from tomorrow onwards?
That is not an easy question, and I'm not sure I'm the person who really should be answering it. I mean, I've been following a lot of the debates about the Humboldt Forum, about the Benin bronzes more broadly. You know, as I said earlier, I think that, you know, as curators in that kind, you know, I think Alina's point then in response was also a good one, that museums are, of course, a heterogeneous kind of institution. Not all museums are the same. But if we're talking about these kind of ethnological museums and we're talking about objects whose provenance comes out of colonialism, then I think that, you know, it is useful to think about curators, not as perpetrators, in fact, I think, but really as implicated subjects, and maybe in particular as what I call perpetuators, right? People who find themselves in the position of perpetuating a colonial project which we thought might have ended long ago, but in fact we realize is still ongoing. And confronting that and trying to figure out ways of repairing it. And I agreed with what you said earlier, Léontine, that it's a matter of restitution on the one hand, and that just seems like that is a given at this point, that objects of unclear or stolen provenance need to be returned, or the offer needs to be made, and relationships have to be reestablished on a new basis. Hopefully one in which things circulate and, you know, are able to be shared broadly around the world. But I think we need to reestablish the basis, and restitution seems like the important first step. But as you said, it's not the reparation is not only restitution. There have to be other things as well. Again, that's something that has to be worked out, I think, in particular communities, in particular institutions, in particular contexts. So there's always a real specificity, I think, to what follows from some of these imperatives, right? The imperative for reparation, the imperative for restitution. Okay, but now let's work it out, you know, in particular places, in particular contexts. I think that, you know, one important thing is maybe the last thing I'll say, because again, I don't feel like I have the answer to this at all, is maybe to think on those different axes of diachronic and synchronic implication. Again, these are abstractions, and I don't know if that's part of what the first question was getting at. When I talk about diachronic and synchronic, I know that these are abstractions and simplifications, and that in fact things are much more entangled. But I do think it might still be useful in museums to think, okay, we have a kind of responsibility that comes out of the past, let's say the colonial past for certain kinds of museums, but then we also have a kind of implication in the inequalities of the present, right, which are sometimes afterlives of those past, but sometimes come from different dynamics. And so to be, I guess, responsible both to the present and to the past simultaneously in the way they come together in their differences, and to try to confront those different dimensions of our implication in the different institutions that we inhabit.
I think that's a very, very beautiful last sentence. Don't you agree, Alina, that
Yes.
it's even poetry, Michael, what you were saying. And since this exhibition, since this direction was very much inspired by poetry, and can poetry build bridges of solidarity between different trauma and people that are in some way or the other inflicted by that trauma, is a beautiful ending to, for me, out of my perspective, a wonderful, inspiring, thought-provoking, but also in a way, ironic and witty conversation we had with the three of us. It was a huge honor to have you both with me tonight here in Dresden, because I'm in Dresden at the Japanese Palace. Michael, you are on the sunny side of life, but Alina is also in the sunny side because she is still in the Baltics, and I hope she will maybe have a good swim to end this evening, and then go to bed. And Michael, you continue your day. I very much hope so that we see each other very soon in a post-Coronian context. Hopefully I can invite you both to break the bread with me in the near future, and that we can invite you to Germany. That would be a real honor, and also for us, for me, a stimulus to think further about what it means to create bridges of solidarity, and also to be implicated as museums, and what kind of responsibility comes from that. I also thank all our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for your questions, which were very dense and compact, and indeed I think some of the questions were so intellectually that it might have been good if we could have read them instead of me reading them out loud. So I hope that you're not frustrated that maybe we did not correct or answered the question correctly. And for all the others who watch this at this other and later moment in time, thank you for watching us, and thank you for being part of this community that came together in the context of our exhibition. Thank you so much. For everybody who is in the European time zone, I wish you all a very, very beautiful evening, a good night's sleep, and hopefully you wake up tomorrow fresh and inspired to actively make this world a slightly better place. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.